Okay, Rob, are you the type of person who, when entering a room with a lot of people, have to assess around you for threats?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah?
Absolutely. I'm looking for the exits. I'm counting the people. I'm figuring out who's left-handed versus right-handed. Who am I bigger than? Who am I not bigger than?
Okay.
Um, no, I say it mostly as a joke, but I spent years training in Krav Maga, which is very much about, it's a very sort of like brutal and survival-based martial art that really gets you in the headspace of threat assessment. So you're always kind of, it's not I wouldn't call it threat assessment so much as I would call it situational awareness.
Okay.
Where you kind of like you're sort of like clocking like the space and who's there. And it's not it's not because I think something's going to go wrong. And it's not even something that I happens like really consciously. Like I kind of do it subconsciously at this point.
Okay. Gotcha. I read somewhere that a lot of guys do this, that maybe they don't talk about it, but when they enter a room, they're assessing, they're looking around. Do you find that to be true, or maybe just your perspective?
Yeah, I don't know. Like, look, there's my fear is that that kind of thinking brushes up on like, we start moving toward like toxic masculinity, which I don't like. And I do everything in my power to avoid at all cost, because the thought in my head is never like, who am I going to fight here? It's like,
Mhm.
hey, like, if something goes wrong, like, how can I safely get out of here? Because also the part of it comes from the fact of like being a parent,
Yeah.
when especially when I'm with my daughter, I'm always like hyper aware of everything that's going on around me. But, even when I'm not with her, that sort of that thing still is there.
Gotcha. All right. Well, thank you for that. Very, very enlightening, very interesting, and related to what we're talking about today. So, welcome everybody to another episode of Speculative Sandbox. This is your audio playground for creative storytellers. I'm very excited to have Rob Hart back on the podcast. I'm currently reading your latest book, Assassins Anonymous, which I'm enjoying very, very much and kind of inspired that question that I just asked you. So, Rob, can you please share with the listeners who you are and your latest projects?
Sure. I'm the author of books like The Warehouse, which is the one that we first spoke about, and The Paradox Hotel. Assassins Anonymous is my latest novel, and it's essentially about if John Wick got into a 12-step recovery program for killers. I write comic books, I co-write novels. I like to keep myself busy, and yeah, Assassins is the one that came out last. That was back in June, so it's fun to still be talking about it, and the people are still reading it.
Fantastic. So when we were going over ideas for this episode in the podcast, you mentioned the assassin is the same as the samurai, is the same as the gunslinger, is the same as the private eye, which fed into deciding on this episode today, which is the lawless lawman. So can you explain what you mean by that and what has interested you in this topic?
Sure. And the first series that I wrote a 5-book series following like an amateur private investigator. And I think I've always been sort of attracted to that type of character because that's the kind of character who sort of, lives outside the bounds of the law and does things that other people can't do. Because I think we all kind of know intrinsically, and this is why these characters are so popular, is that, the law and justice are two very different things,
Hmm.
and unfortunately, we live in a time where we know that if you have money, if you have power, you could basically do whatever you want. And whereas if you have no money or you have no power, and especially if you're part of any kind of minority class, then you're pretty much on your own, like no matter what happens. And I think there's something comforting about that character trope where we can see that there's someone who's willing to put their neck on the line to stand up for somebody, and it's this great sort of like recurring thing where and we see it all throughout history again, like as far back as the Ronin samurai, the masterless samurai who, this image of them kind of like traveling the countryside and righting wrongs, through like the big surge in private detectives, especially around like the film noir era.
Hmm.
And then yeah, the gunslinger was a really big one, when that exploded, and I guess like maybe the 60s and the 70s. And the assassin character, I think, kind of fits within that because a lot of times when we're watching stories about assassins, they're always like good assassins.
Hmm.
Like they have a code and they only kill bad people. Um,
It made
which
me
to a
think
degree
of
is
Dexter, who only kills serial killers.
Yeah, yeah,
Mhm.
exactly. Though that is one of the things that I wanted to kind of play with in Assassin's Anonymous, which is like it's really easy for us to cast people as villains and say like, well, that guy deserved it. But the thing is like when someone gets killed, it doesn't matter what they've done in their lives. Like there is someone in the world whose life is worse because of that. They had a family member or a loved one or a friend who is now suffering because that person is gone.
Mhm.
And I one of the reasons I wanted to write Assassins Anonymous was like watching the John Wick movies and like he's shooting so many, every single person he shoots in the head probably had a family. And I'm like, well, what
Mhm.
about that guy? You know? And at the end of the day, when you look at these sort of like quasi deep state government organizations that are like sending around assassins to kill people in these kinds of stories, you have to wonder, are those people really evil or are they just troublesome? Are they in someone else's way? Are they preventing someone else from getting what they want? So you really get into a lot of moral gray areas and a lot of really fun territory in terms of like, what is the cost of this and what is the price of this, especially to someone's soul, because clearly there are people who can live with that kind of behavior. Like there are people in the military, people who go into law enforcement who can, carry the burden of taking a life in an extraordinary situation. But it's not a cut and dry thing.
I love how I feel like from 90s, 2000s media, where Power Rangers is a good example, where the good guys are fighting bad guys and they're totally expendable. And we see that in James Bond, like what you're mentioning. But now I feel like the nuances of these acts are being explored so much more in today's media to be able to really unpack, well, who are these background characters that we otherwise may not have thought anything of before? Like you said, they are real people. Do you see storytelling evolving over time to kind of be more accommodating to those different perspectives now compared to like back in the 90s?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think it's a function of a couple of things. One is that overall, as a people, we're becoming more mindful. We're
Mm.
starting to learn that there are behaviors and actions that are just like super not okay. Like if you think about how 20, 30 years ago, like homophobia was like rampant and almost like accepted within modern society, and now it's recognized as like the hateful and hurtful thing that it is. Like it,
Mhm.
it takes us time to come around to these things. But I also think that there's a degree to which we need more from stories, because we have been subjected to so many different kinds of storytelling techniques and so many different kinds of stories. We can't keep watching the same thing over and over again. It's something that I've noticed with watching movies with my daughter
Mm.
because when I was a kid, I feel like a lot of the movies I was watching were like, here's a bunch of robots and they're going to smash into each other and it's going to be fun. And now it's like I take her to go see movies and it's like, hey, let's talk about generational trauma.
Yeah.
And then I'm sitting there watching Encanto with her crying like a baby
Hmm.
and or watching Inside Out and like it just feels like emotional terrorism. And feeling like I didn't have access to those kinds of stories when I was a kid, but those stories are not only necessary in terms of our development, but I think as an audience, audiences are demanding that like they want to see stories that are pushing them, that are pushing characters, that are sort of expanding the boundaries of what a story can do.
Hmm. Before I jump into some of these questions that we have here, which kind of unpacks a little bit more the societal, historical, cultural contexts, I've heard two things. One is if you try to hire an assassin yourself, you're likely probably contacting police,
Yes.
or it is true out there. So what do you think? Can we hire assassins, or is it all kind of, little honeypots for the police to catch you?
I think if the sort of like rank and file day-to-day person goes on Craigslist and tries to hire an assassin, more than
Mm.
likely they're talking to a cop. My sort of loose understanding is that like if you really want to take that seriously, you have to move more into like the dark web territory because
Okay.
no legitimate assassin or hitman is using Craigslist. You have to go through, the proper channels in terms of like not being able to be tracked and not being able to like be sort of like caught doing that. There is sort of a degree of assassination when it comes. I think that it's more in the realm of like governments and countries and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I think that's sort of like when I wrote Assassins Anonymous, one of the people that I went to for a blurb was Alma Katsu. And Alma is a fantastic writer. She was in the CIA, and she was an analyst, I think, and she wrote these two really really great spy novels, Red London and Red Widow. And it's cool because she actually has to send the manuscripts to the CIA for them to sign off on, because they have to make sure that she didn't inadvertently give away something or some kind of information that would be damaging. But the thing that's when I gave her the book, I was like, look, I know that I wrote the Lord of the Rings version of what you did in real life, but I hope you enjoy it. And she did. She really liked it. But yeah, like she understood what I meant, that like the world is not full of like secret societies of assassins, like, like
Hmm.
moving the scales of power back and forth. Like all of that is kind of make believe. It's like it doesn't mean I don't enjoy it, but when I'm watching John Wick and there are assassins literally killing each other in Grand Central Terminal, and to such a skillful degree that the commuters don't even notice, I'm like, come on.
It's so fun to watch, right? But yeah,
It
it's a
is.
matter of like entertainment serving as this colorful funhouse mirror of these real
Yeah.
life ideas.
Yeah, and it's also my understanding that there weren't like, stoic men wandering around the Old West, just like, getting themselves into situations and like saving townsfolk. Like
Hmm.
that's also, and I'm sure like the idea of the Ronin samurai, like, as sort of like, what you would see in like Akira Kurosawa's movies, like that's sort of an embellishment as well. Like maybe some of these figures did exist on like a smaller scale, but like we kind of build it out because again, like I think we like the comfort of those characters because we like to think that there's someone out there who's like willing to stick up for us.
All right. So then, with all of that in mind, when we're talking about the different archetypes of these lawless lawmen, how do you find the historical and cultural context shaping their portrayals?
That's interesting. I think that you're dealing with sort of different cultural paradigms for each one.
Hmm.
Because again, like if you want to write about a samurai, you're writing about, ancient Japan, which is, that's a whole culture unto itself, which is a culture that is like largely unfamiliar to us in the West.
Hmm.
I think like watching Shogun was a really good example of that, where you can kind of see like what the differences in honor and decorum are between like and what a culture shock it was having like a white I think it was a Danish character, or he just spoke Portuguese. I don't remember, but like having like a Western character meeting this Eastern influence and just not understanding things. Um, I think when you get into like the realm of the private eye, it's interesting because then you've got someone who like they're very often ex-cops. So you're
Hmm.
dealing with like this idea of law enforcement. And, I would like to say that law enforcement used to be more corrupt. It's probably just as corrupt, if not more today. They're just, often better at getting away with it. And then when you're dealing with like the gunslinger type, that's fun because then you're getting into like the Old West stuff because you're getting into that real sense of lawlessness,
Mm-hmm.
because a private eye might operate in a city like, New York or LA where there is law enforcement. The law enforcement is just sort of, corrupt or ineffectual. Where you're in the Old West and you might be in a lawless town in the middle of nowhere, and it's
Hmm.
basically like, whatever you say goes. So the context is always really cool in terms of like what that setting is going to bring to the story, what the cultural components are going to bring to the story, and how everyone is going to bounce off that.
Would you consider superheroes an extension of the lawless lawman then?
You know, it's interesting because and I was literally thinking about this like because I was reading over your notes earlier about the show, and I was like I'm going back and forth on that one. I think to a degree, yes, but I do think it leans into an interesting territory when we're talking about superheroes because then we start getting into some like low-key fascism,
Mm,
and
okay.
in terms of like someone deciding that because they're more powerful, their will should be imposed on others. Which in some instances, like you take a character like Captain America is not a fascist. Like he just wants, truth and justice for everyone, like Superman, all of them. But then you get into like the anti-hero characters, like even Batman gets kind of wonky to me sometimes because I'm like, man, like why not take those billions of dollars and instead of making a bat plane, like invest in like homeless and mental health services?
Such a good
Um,
point. Yeah, because you have these people who are acting outside the law, but it's in a degree, it's an extension of them believing that they are above or outside of or no better than the law.
yeah, yeah, and it's putting the superpowers into play, kind of like it's interesting because whenever we're following these this character trope, it's always someone who's incredibly good at what they do. Like if it's an assassin, they're the best assassin. If they're a PI, they're a brilliant person that's making connections that no one else is. If they're a gunslinger, they are the best shot in the West. And so their abilities are almost bordering on superhuman, but not quite there. Whereas, and that's why to me, superheroes is like sort of the same, but sort of in its own class because suddenly you've got someone who can like punch a planet in half
Yeah.
and like what that means because they can very easily on a dime say what, like whatever I want goes and no one's going to stop me.
So does this work then if the lawless lawman is really bad at what he's doing?
you know
Does he
I
become
mean,
the villain then?
I guess so. If they were really bad at what they were doing, I almost feel like they would not be interesting to watch,
Hmm.
because that's the thing is we like this is something that I teach a lot when I'm teaching writing is authority, like the authority of characters. And there are two kinds of authority. There's head authority and there's heart authority. And heart authority is, being sort of like open and honest and vulnerable and connecting with both your reader and the other characters. And head authority is showing proficiency because we trust characters who are proficient in things. Like the reason that we trust like Tony Stark in Iron Man off the bat is because even though he's a narcissist and even though he's a bit of a prick, he is brilliant.
Hmm.
So we're willing to forgive him just about anything else. Sherlock Holmes, especially in modern portrayals, can be kind of an asshole. Like he's not always very nice to people, but he's
Hmm.
so smart. And we see him being so smart. They dem the people who create these things demonstrate those things so well that we automatically trust them. And that's why I always am pushing people when I'm working with other authors is like you want to establish your character's authority right off the bat because if your reader trusts your characters, you could basically do anything.
So then what makes it so attractive to operate outside the law? Why do we love these characters so much?
I mean, I think, and this is going back to what I said before, like I think we recognize like how unjust this world is.
Hmm.
I mean, we had a president who has like very clearly broken many, 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 many laws, like a lot of laws. Right now in New York City, the mayor just got, dinged out for accepting like hundreds of $1,000s in gifts from a foreign government in exchange for favors. And this is almost this kind of stuff has become so common. We've gotten so used to it that we all just kind of shrug. We're like, well, nothing's going to happen because they're rich and powerful.
Yeah.
And I think that even within that complacency, there's still a lot of frustration of like, why does it have to be like this? And meanwhile, like, we're the ones who are like getting, we're paying too much on our taxes when large corporations aren't paying anything. And we're getting hassled for, just recently the NYPD like shot like four people because someone jumped a turnstile. It's
Wow.
like the balances of power have shifted to a degree that it almost feels like hopeless,
Hmm.
and
You wish that you
so
could just reach in there and get past the red tape and all the systemic barriers to be able to
yeah.
find some sort of solution, which is difficult to do when you're just Joe Schmo or somebody, a resident that doesn't have those resources.
Yeah, yeah. So I think there's almost like a little bit of catharsis in watching it, where we watch someone because these characters are almost always going after people who are powerful and taking down people who are powerful, and we like to believe that those people are vulnerable,
Hmm.
because I feel like in our day-to-day life we don't see them as vulnerable, we see them as completely untouchable.
So when you going back to what you said earlier about the people getting shot by John Wick, they have families, they have children maybe, they have lives. So inserting that interesting level of complexity now to these real world situations where the people that we hate, the people that we feel strongly about, they also have those ties. So how like
Yeah,
yeah, how do you wrap your head around that, I guess you can say.
it's tough. It's
Hmm.
tough. I mean. I again like with the John Wick, cannon fodder henchmen, like, I always kind of wonder like what brought someone to a place. Like some of those guys may have decided like, you know what, I like hurting innocent people. Like this is cool. And some of those guys may have had no options. Maybe they, have a record and can't get a legitimate job and they have a family to support and they find themselves having to do more and more unsavory things just to survive in this hellscape of a world. And it's like I always kind of feel like we like to think that there's a choice, like, oh, you could just choose to do good, but not everyone has that choice.
Hmm.
So my line of demarcation is like, what have you chosen in this moment? Like, were you backed against the wall and you did whatever you had to do to survive, or did you say, you know what? Nah, I don't care. Like, I'm just going to do whatever I want because I want to satisfy and please myself.
So then from a writer's perspective, taking all this into consideration, how do you then navigate this moral ambiguity with your character? Do you find it challenging to keep them sympathetic or justified in their actions?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, writing Mark and Assassins was like kind of a challenge because like I've got this guy who is the world's best hitman, but I want him to be sympathetic to the reader.
Hmm.
And one of the things I did functionally, like right off the bat, is I made him really charming and really funny.
Hmm.
I wanted him to be the kind of character that you just really enjoyed being around because I also knew that like this is a guy who is going to get into a recovery program. If he got into a recovery program, he hits a rock bottom. And what does a rock bottom look like for someone who kills people professionally?
Hmm.
That's got to be a pretty dark place. And so I knew that like if the reader didn't love him, then by the time we hit that rock bottom, the reader could walk away and
Hmm.
be done with it. So I think when writing those characters, it's really important to kind of like access their humanity and find ways for us to kind of like understand and sympathize. Like on one hand, Mark is this incredibly talented assassin, and yes, like not like we're not you and I are not assassins unless there are things that you have not told me about yourself, but I'm
Oh.
willing to bet. And but the thing is, Mark is still an addict. And one of those things that is at the root of addiction is the like the reward, that feeling of reward when you do something really good and you get praise for it, or you might get like monetary gain for it, like that swell of pride you get about
Hmm.
being good at the thing that you do. Like those are things that you and I can understand.
Hmm.
Like if we write a really good book, or we do something that garners like a nice bit of attention or a nice contract, we feel really good about ourselves. It's like, hey, this is awesome.
Hmm.
So at least at that point, there's an access point where you can kind of understand, like, okay, I don't know what it's like for this guy to kill someone, but I know what it's like to feel like you're actually good at your job.
That's really good insight because I was about to ask you from a writing craft perspective, how do you make someone likable? And it sounds like it's about tapping into that relatability for the character.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes it's like little like shortcuts, like one
Mhm.
of the things I did was give Mark a cat. Just because I thought it would be funny for him to have a cat, but also in my head, I'm like, well, if a cat can love him and animals have instincts for this kind of thing, then people can love him,
Hmm.
you know.
I do love
Uh,
that he has a cat. I do love this character. I haven't gotten to that rock bottom that you mentioned yet, but he is definitely very likable straight out of the bat. And the way that you crafted your chapters to be very compelling and motivating to keep turning the page, I think also helps in the scenarios that you put him in, as well as Mark's perspective on everything. So I think all of that combined, I found him to be very likable at the beginning.
Good. He was a fun character, right? Like
Mhm.
I had so much fun on that book. I can't talk too much about the sequel because the sequel sort of like will reframe some things that happened in the first book,
Okay.
but the sequel actually follows another character
Okay.
from this book. Mark is still there, but it's also this other character, and that character's sort of like history and background and how they came to being an assassin. So
Gotcha.
and that's the fun thing about the whole Assassins Anonymous setting is I can just sort of like move people in and out and focus on different characters. Like, I mean, in a perfect world, I'll write like 10 of these.
Well, and even just the approach to Assassins Anonymous being parallel to Alcoholics Anonymous, you've got the meeting with the donuts and the setting in that regard, and that is also very relatable to people that can understand that perspective. And I think it's a fun twist to kind of take something that is familiar and apply it to something that's kind of sensational and fun.
Yeah, yeah. I was very lucky in the sense that I wanted to write an assassin book for a very long time, and I thought a group therapy setting would be kind of funny, but also like an interesting way to sort of like unpack some of these ideas. And then when I thought about it in terms of recovery, I was like, oh, because the thing that's cool about recovery is that it gives the story a structure in the sense that, you've got these regular meetings and recovery has a step process. And part of that step process is making amends. And it's like, what does making amends look like for a professional killer? And I have some friends who are in recovery who were incredibly generous, like with their time and with their stories. And, you know, uh, the message I got from all of them was the same. It was like, just you have to take this seriously. It can't be a sort of like cute little thing because recovery saves people's lives. And, I tried to honor that as much as I could while adapting it to sort of like a fantastical setting. And I'm happy to say that the people who, my friends who are in recovery who've read it, other people in recovery who've read it and reached out have said that I did an admirable job or a respectful job in handling that, which makes me feel good because, I don't, this isn't just some fun way for me to like come up with a hook. Like it's gotta mean something.
Yeah. Well, this in the warehouse too, I feel like you've taken a lot of care and consideration for the topic matter that you're kind of addressing from the societal perspective. So, I really like it. When you're building these stories, do you start with establishing your character first and building the world and plot around it, or do you start with your plot and then fill in the world and the characters?
I always kind of start off with a kernel. I mean, The Warehouse was an article I read years and years ago about a reporter who got a job at a fulfillment center.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, oh, there's a book here. And with Assassins, again, I had this idea for years and years and years of like, take a bunch of assassins, have them in a recovery program, in a therapy program. This would be cool. And then just one day it clicked, like, oh, like, recovery. This is awesome. So it's always kind of that kernel, and then figuring out how to populate it. You know, the warehouse was slightly more of a challenge because that had three POV characters, and
Hmm.
for the longest time, I only had the first two. I didn't really understand the book until I figured out who the third one should be. With Assassins, I mean, I kind of right off the bat, I kind of Mark was in my head for this one. Like, I just kind of like the idea of a sort of like, kind of sweet, kind of funny, kind of an unassuming guy who just happened to be like immensely dangerous if you
Mm-hmm.
crossed him. Um, but yeah, I think so. So I think it kind of goes kernel of the idea to sort of the character to building out the world itself.
Gotcha. Okay, so then when keeping your readers in mind and just t looking at this kind of ambiguity in the lawman over, the last decades and how people perceive them, do you think that the readers' changing attitudes toward authority, justice, and morality affects how they engage with stories with characters like this?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think again, like we have just come to accept that there are no consequences for anyone anymore.
Mm,
Like it's this increasing drumbeat of like watching like Supreme Court justices like literally take tons of like gifts and trips from people and then like rule however they want to rule and like dismantling democracy. And we just kind of have to sit there and everyone's like, well, no one can do anything about it because this is the system that we have and it doesn't work, but we can't think of another one.
hmm
Um, watching I just recently watched Rebel Ridge, which was great, great, great movie on Netflix. That's a perfectly tuned thriller that's basically about civil asset forfeiture, which is about how the police can literally take your shit and just not give it back to you and claim like they don't even have to prove that the thing that you have was acquired in the commission of a crime. They just have to believe it is.
mm,
And there are countless examples of cops literally just taking money from people, being like, "Oh, we think you got this in a drug deal, so it's ours now." And the process of getting it back is so complicated that most people can't even do that. And then where does that money go? It goes into the precinct's pocket, which is basically the cops' pockets. So yeah, I think, and again, that's why we sort of like really yearn for these characters, is because like we just want to believe that someone's going to go after the bad guys, because more and more the bad guys are people in power at any level, whether they're rich, whether they're a government official, whether they're in law enforcement. It feels more and more rare to see someone who is in power who is not like a complete and total monster.
Hmm. Adversely, can you think of, and I'm kind of might be putting you on the spot here, so if you can't think of anything off the top of your head, that's fine. Has there been a lawless lawman character in fictional history that you go back and you watch it and you're like, maybe I don't really agree with this perspective anymore. Maybe it's a too much a product of its time.
That's interesting. That's a good question. I can't think of anything off the top of my head. The only thing that kind of comes to mind, and I don't know how much it really fits the topic, but did you see The Last of Us on HBO?
Um, I
It's
yes.
like based on the video game.
Yes. Sorry. I have like all these different variations of titles that have Last of and Us and all that stuff. So yes, the video game that has what's his name in it with the girl?
Pedro Pascal.
Pedro Pascal. Yes. Yes, I know who you're talking
Yeah.
about.
So, and look, the second season's going to start soon, and so at this point, I feel like if we're 6 months out from the end, it's not a spoiler anymore. But the way that character, he's a sort of like that's sort of like a Western,
Hmm.
in terms of like there's no law enforcement anymore. They're all in the middle of nowhere. No matter where they are, they're in the middle of nowhere because society has collapsed. And there's this like evil organization that, wants to like, do this thing to this kid to try to cure everyone of this disease.
Hmm.
And the way that he at the end of the season, and like if you're really concerned about spoilers, listeners, you can plug your ears for like 30 seconds. But the way at the end of the season he turns around and just slaughters all of these people, it was disturbing. And
Hmm.
it was like, and they didn't play it as a hero moment because it's not a hero moment. And in any other story, that would have been the hero moment because it's like, oh, he's going to save this girl. But the girl had already agreed to sacrifice herself for the greater good,
Hmm.
So he's making a selfish choice at this point to like it's horrifying to watch. It goes from this entire season of like seeing this guy as the hero, and then all of a sudden it turns into a horror movie in like the last half hour. And I loved that because that was really subverting that expectation.
That's a really good example. Characters who end up becoming more selfish in their actions that result in that greater good kind of being at risk. It is really interesting because it kind of forces us, the listener, the reader, the viewer, to really examine whose side we're on because we've spent the whole show getting really intimate with these characters, so we don't want to lose them. And so we cheer him on for that act, even though it would affect the rest of the humanity. Do you think what would you do in that situation if you were faced with that?
God, I'm a dad. That's a tough one. I mean,
Yeah.
and he's a former dad who has now accepted this little girl as like a surrogate daughter. Like that's a
Hmm.
tough one. Um, maybe another interesting example is like I'm way in the minority on this, but like I did not dislike the ending of Game of Thrones. I actually thought like it was kind of like the natural progression of where that story was supposed to go.
Hmm.
Um, because the entire show, obviously, yes. Like, well, first off, it was a show that started off by clearly saying, like, this is not your average fantasy show. Like, we are not here to make you happy. We are here to show you what reality is like. And they underscored that by killing Ned Stark at the end of the first season. Like
Hmm.
it's like, here's your protagonist. He's dead now. And I think everyone kind of accepted Daenerys as the protagonist of that
Hmm.
show. But the thing is like if you like I because I rewatched it like last year because I got COVID and I spent like a couple of days on the couch just rewatching the entire series, and it's kind of there.
Hmm.
Daenerys is for the entire run of the series a conqueror. Like she's not a benevolent leader. She is a conqueror. Now, granted, she's killing the correct people in the beginning. The warlords and the slavers, and she's liberating people, but it's almost like a little disturbing. Like there's sort of like this white savior thing going on where she's going into these sort of like, foreign countries and like, yes, it's good that she's throwing out the slave masters, but then she's conscripting these people into her armies. And like, and yes, like she starts off as a victim of sexual assault in the beginning of the series. And there is an actual strong and clear through line about her reclaiming her own power. But as she reclaims that power, she wants more power. And then, she just gets to the point where her response to everything is like, well, we should burn them to death. And for a long time, she has advisors who are like, maybe don't do that. Like, maybe be nice. Until finally she amassed enough power that she didn't have to listen to her advisors anymore. And she was like, well, now I'm just going to burn everyone and I don't care. So I think that was a really interesting character that, didn't feel problematic and kind of became problematic. But if you
Mm-hmm.
really, really watch closely, actually was problematic for a lot of the run, but was treated in such a way that you're kind of like forgiving of it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's maybe even a longer conversation. But yeah, no, I was not as upset with that series as everyone else is. I think they kind of delivered on what the promise was, even if it was maybe a little bit like truncated at the
Yeah,
end, like
faster.
rushed.
No, I agree with you. I really love Daenerys as this what she was at the very end. I had read some analysis based off of the books during that time where they were really unpacking her written character development and how she showed so many signs of that kind of brutal dictator in the making, especially with how she treated people at every stop of the way. So it's interesting to see that in real life, then the audience reacting to that change. And putting aside the argument about whether or not it should have happened in a season or two or whatever, the time, like the pacing of it all, there are some people that truly believed and saw Daenerys as a symbol of a woman overcoming her strengths, and then some people found the switch to be like a villainizing of a woman in power. Um, it's interesting because you can make an argument, I guess, for any bad person that does something bad. You can make the argument that they're a product of their circumstances, um, but they're still making those actions. So how do we reckon as a society when we look at these really complex characters? Like, are they good? Are they bad? Or can it just be nuanced?
Well, that's the thing. I think a lot of ways in fiction we are seeking characters who are purely good or purely evil because there's that sort of we want the black and white because it's just easier, but everyone is nuanced. Like everyone has these, even the greatest people in the world have skeletons in their closet. Like I have tried my best to be a good person and I have made mistakes, and there are things I've done that I'm not proud of. And I always try to temper that by trying to learn from those mistakes and carry on in a more mature and thoughtful way. But yeah, I don't know. I think we constantly live in a state of gray, and that can be really hard. And I think that's why in fiction it's kind of fun to dismantle those states of gray, but it could also like go off the rails really quickly, like exactly with Daenerys, because it's like we don't want to we wanted her to be a benevolent ruler and to win and to bring peace. And I think that it was pretty clear from the get-go, like no one who actively seeks power is probably doing it for selfless intention. They're doing it because they want power. And if you want power, you're probably not the person who should have power.
Mm.
And but at the same time, I'm sure there are plenty of politicians who like have been effective and have sought power. So yeah, I don't know. It's weird. We just live in a weird world.
I have this saying where humans are weird, and sometimes I say humans are cute because sometimes we do cute, weird things. But yeah, we're just complicated people.
Yep.
So I have some listener questions, and mind you, some of these questions we may have already covered, but I'm going to read them anyway in case you'd
Yeah.
like to reiterate. So the first one is, are these characters lawless, or do they just have a personal code that they value higher than the law?
Interesting. I mean, technically, no one's lawless because there's always going to be some kind of law that you're going to get jammed up on. And a lot of these characters always manage to somehow kind of like skirt the law, but yeah, and again, I think that's something that we like to see in these characters is like having a code, you
Mhm.
know. Like it's very popular in assassin movies for the assassin to have a code, like they're not going to kill women, they're not going to kill kids, something like that. Or yeah, it's that's an interesting question. That's getting into some nuance. But Lawless Lawman is just a great sort of like that's some great alliteration right there.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Okay. That's fair. Okay, then another question would be, is the lawless lawman character more anti-hero or anti-villain?
I mean, I would say, I guess like anti-hero in the sense that, you know, they're not they're not playing by the rules and they're not playing by the laws to the letter. And I
Mhm.
think when we think of hero, we think of someone who is like completely like unbesmirched and sort of like, has not done anything wrong. But again, that's getting into a weird place of nuance. I mean, look, I personally, I think most laws are like deeply, deeply, deeply unjust. So anyone who is sort of doing something because it's just rather than it's right, rather than it's the law, like if they're choosing what's right over what the law says, like I'm going to be on that person's side. So that person is a hero to me. They're not even an anti-hero. They're like doing the right thing. So,
Well, when you're thinking of lawless lawman too, or maybe lawless law person, generalize it, it also exists solely in the context of the society that they exist in and what those laws are. Let's say that we live in this weird hell planet and they sacrifice babies once they turn two. You're the lawless lawman by rescuing those babies and taking them to a little
yeah.
jungle, place.
Yeah. Yeah. Or like you even like look at right now, like Roe v. Wade got overturned and there are states that have outlawed abortion and there are people who are like setting up systems to get women to states where they can get abortions if they need them. And those people are technically breaking the law.
Mm-hmm.
Those people are also heroes because they are assisting women at a time of need and in a society that has made that need greater and more dangerous. So it's like that person's not an anti-hero. That person is a capital H, like underscored, underlined hero. So it's yeah, again, I guess it's like it depends on the character. Like maybe Dexter is a good example of like an anti-hero, because he's still killing people. And from what I recall, he did kill some innocent people in that show, or
Mm-hmm.
people who didn't necessarily deserve it. Um, so yeah, I guess it depends on the context.
And this question did get me thinking. I'm familiar with an anti-hero. I'm not as familiar with an anti-villain. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah. No, no, no,
Okay.
no. That I don't. I wonder if that's just sort of like maybe Dexter is an anti-villain in that he's
Mm,
technically a villain because he's a serial killer, but he's kind of not a
kind
villain
of not a
because he's a
villain.
good serial killer. Like that's some real sort of like, wobbly line area.
Okay. All right. So rounding out, we have a game. This one's fun, and I'm probably putting you on the spot. I'm sorry, but I think you can do
Awesome.
this. I think you can handle this. Okay.
Okay.
This is a rapid fire game. I'm going to name a time and place that's basically a fictional time and place, and you kind of come up with the corresponding lawless lawman archetype.
Ooh, okay.
Okay. All
Okay.
right. I tried to have fun with this. We'll see. We'll see. Okay, cyberpunk future. Who's the lawless lawman
Ooh.
gonna be?
See, cyberpunk future, immediately I go to like, I would love to see like a gunslinger type character, like a cyborg cowboy.
Ooh. Okay. All right. Who is he fighting against?
Ooh, I'm gonna say like an evil corporation.
Okay.
I feel like everything I write is against an evil corporation, so that's a little bit cheating, but corporations are the most evil thing ever. So,
Okay,
and
perfect.
I assume that like our post-apocalyptic future is going to be brought about by corporations.
All right. Going in the opposite direction. Medieval kingdom. Who's your lawless lawman?
Oh, it would be really easy to say knight, but I also think it would be awesome if the knight was also like a private eye and was like trying to solve crimes, but
Ooh,
using like medieval methods to like figure out like who did what.
that's awesome. Like maybe someone murdered the queen and he gets to ha roam the castle and solve who did that.
Yeah. See, this is a good idea. I'm getting some material out of
There we go.
this.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Okay. Um, Close to cyberpunk future, I'm gonna say post-apocalyptic wasteland.
Post-apocalyptic wasteland. Okay. See, now I just want to keep things interesting. So I would say we return back to sort of like a feudal system. And so a Ronin samurai who sort of like fell out with his feudal lord and is now
Okay.
sort of like, doing like post-apocalyptic samurai shit.
I love the idea of feudalism in a post-apocalyptic wasteland. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. And the last one is space frontier.
Space Frontier. I did always want to do like sort of like a murder mystery set on a space station or like a Mars base or something, and
Okay.
have like the guy who's like the private eye who like works in one of these places because I feel like that would just be a fun setting for it. I mean, so me and Alex Segura actually have a sci-fi space novel coming out in October, so soon. It's October 8th, I think, and it's about it's espionage. So it's like space espionage. So it's like spies and stuff.
Oh, fun.
So that's kind of like in the realm of that. But yeah, no, I always feel like space is just a fun setting to write.
Awesome. All right. Well, I thought you did really well considering I sprung all that on you. So that's awesome. Glad you're inspired. Let's see if
Yeah.
you, maybe who knows, you're gonna write about a investigative night in some sort of medieval land. That'll be your next book. And you can put me in your acknowledgments.
I'm gonna have to sit down and think about this because this is a fun idea.
Okay, all right. So wrapping up, let's get back to our listeners who are writers and thinking about Lawless Lawman. So when writing books about this character archetype, what are some factors that you should be considering? What advice would you give for writers? I'm talking stakes, motives, traits, etc.
I think the most important thing to remember is that your character is a person. I feel like there's this attraction to writing these characters in a way that makes them like really superhuman and really cool. And there's a degree to which, yeah, like it's kind of awesome, like having these like uber proficient characters who can like basically like handle anything that's thrown at them. But and sometimes I see and it's overdone in such a way that the character is therefore no longer relatable and no longer believable. And I would just say it's important for people to keep in mind that their characters at the end of the day are human beings. And, if we can't relate to them and kind of like understand them, then we're going to lose the plot and we're not going to care about them enough to follow them. It's going to feel like a 90s action movie where it's like gone from your head the second you're done watching it, you know.
That's great advice. All right, Rob, thank you so much for joining me. Do you have any final remarks or promotions you'd like to give before we finish?
No, I plugged Dark Space, which is coming out soon. And the Assassin's Anonymous sequel will be out next summer. It's called the Medusa Protocol, and it's a fun one. I had a lot of fun writing that book. So yeah, yeah.
All right. Thank you. And thank you guys for joining us today. And we'll be back with another episode next week. But in the meantime, Rob, how can they follow you on social media?
I am at robwhart.com. Most of these days I'm on Threads and Twitter at robwhart1. I mean, no, Threads and Instagram. I'm sorry. Twitter is a dumpster fire. Um, and then I also have a Substack, robwhart.substack.com.
All right. Thanks. All right. Bye, everybody.